Hello, hello, and welcome to This Week in the Middle East with myself, Francis Matthew, and Eddie O'Sullivan, my co-host. Eddie, here you are. Silent this time. And our guest this week is Dr. Emile Nakhleh, who is a member of the Council for Foreign Affairs, but also the founding director of Political Islam Strategic Analysis at the CIA. And he's just been telling us he was doing that since the 90s. So, Emile, you're the man to have on the show. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I think we start with the rather extraordinary developments over the last 2 or 3 days in Gaza, where a deal which has been long in the making has suddenly come to pass. Clearly, the heavy influence of Stephen Witkoff, Trump's special advisor in the Middle East, has sort of brought heads together. But as we're speaking now, it's still uncertain exactly what the deal is, and it's uncertain if the Israelis will take it. Where do you see it going?
I tend to be a bit positive about the deal. I made a statement yesterday, about two days ago, arguing that the deal will go through because of the unique pressure of the incoming administration and the outgoing administration in the United States. So we see both President Biden as the outgoing president and President Trump as the incoming president. Both of them are putting pressure for their own interests and legacies to get the deal going. And I think that combined pressure is what finally made Prime Minister Netanyahu look favorably upon the deal. I know he raised some issues today, but I think very few people accept his claim that Hamas is the one that's holding it up. I think today, even Haaretz, the newspaper in Israel, said that it is really Netanyahu who is holding the deal up. And if that is the case, then the pressure will become more, as we speak, I think, more unrelenting on him by both administrations, if you will, to sign that deal. And I am optimistic, I would say 60-40, 70-30 almost, that a deal will be signed by the end of the day.
But Emile, I'm just going to come back before Eddie comes in. There's a problem because I don't know what the deal is, and I don't think anybody does. There seems to be an initial deal to swap hostages for the ceasefire and some prisoners, but where it goes in the end is extremely unclear. So I'm not sure what this deal is.
Yes, my optimism really is about the first part of the deal. The deal is very similar to the proposal that President Biden made back in May. Is very similar to that.
Yes.
So the problem to me is what will come after the first part, because as we know, the deal is like 3 parts, and the first part now is supposed to start Sunday. So we do have really a number of what I call wild cards that could unravel the deal. There are a number of wild cards, and most of those, I think, pertain to domestic Israeli politics. I think that is where the biggest wild card. I really think that the Hamas, the Arab world, and the whole region has accepted that deal. So to start the deal. So I think the pressure will be on Mr. Netanyahu to figure out how to address those domestic pressures on him. I think he seems to be now on the almost winning side, that the extreme right-wing elements, including the Orthodox Zionist party that is opposed to the deal, I think they are going to relent in the end. And so that's what gives me a cause of optimism. But you are right. No, I'm not talking about the second and third stages of that deal.
Eddie.
Now,
Eddie,
if the deal goes through and it survives the first 42 days, then I think this will be truly a game changer in the region.
Yes, well, Emile, a pleasure to hear you, and I agree with you 100%. In fact, I'm more positive on this one. The world's sick of this, and they want the killing to stop in Gaza. There's an overwhelming consensus on that, and I suppose the question will be for the history books is why wasn't it done sooner? Anyway, we're not looking at that. Let's just be pleased that we are looking at the prospect from Sunday that the killing will stop. And then, of course, the aid will come in, and then we'll get the cameras and the media in, and then we'll get something approaching to the truth about the scale of the human loss in which has been disputed so far. The question, I suppose, interests me, Emile, looking forward. There is talk that basically Trump is looking, he's aiming to do things quickly, which is that to get Netanyahu to this point, he's holding up the promise that he will be able to put some leverage on Saudi Arabia in particular to move towards a normalization process. Do you think that's just complete wishful thinking? Do you think Saudi Arabia has got the stomach, to basically ignore many of the things it said in the past and seek normalization? So what do you think? What do you think of that scenario, or do you think it's just fanciful and it's not in the immediate prospect?
Eddie, I think you are absolutely correct about Trump's plans. That is his goal, to get ultimately widen the scope of the so-called Abraham Accords. The Saudi Arabia, in my view, is going to come into the picture once that a statement to the effect that we are now seeing a path forward toward a Palestinian state. I mean, they are not going to be focusing on the implementation of that, but they need that statement from the Trump administration and the Netanyahu administration, if he survives this deal, his government. Without that statement, Saudi Arabia will not play.
I agree with you 100%, Emile. I think you're absolutely on the button on that one as well. So the question is, how can Netanyahu or any Israeli government make that kind of declaration when Netanyahu in particular, and it seems the majority of the Israeli population are simply cannot contemplate the creation of a separate Palestinian entity? How can that possibly be achieved? How can you get the Israelis to make such a statement when Netanyahu has always opposed the Palestinian state?
Yes. Well, there are two points there, right? One, your question is well taken, but it's based on the assumption that Netanyahu is going to survive this and the Netanyahu government is going to move forward. I would give it 10%, 20% that this government would fall and a new government would emerge. Now, if that's the case, that would be easier. But the problem is what Saudi Arabia needs really a face-saving a statement. They need that statement about a path forward. And that statement, unless that statement comes, I don't think Saudi Arabia would join in that so-called Abraham Accords plus.
But Emile, the problem is that you can make a statement about a path forward, but you don't have to go down the path.
Well, that's exactly what will happen, in my view, back to Eddie's point. If a Netanyahu government or some similar government stays in place, I don't think they are going to go down that path. So I think, I'm sorry to say, but I think the rhetoric in the beginning might be enough for the Saudis to join the process. And,
my feeling is that the ball's going to be in the Saudi Arabians' court. Really, it's in the Saudi Arabians' court because the MBS has the personal relationship with Trump and with the White House. And I think the issue is that the Saudi Arabians are making it very clear, and I think it would be a disastrous failure for a Saudi foreign policy credibility completely if they just blow over. So they need it. But I think what will happen if they don't get it, and I don't think they will, And I think they're expecting not to get it. I think the Saudi Arabians are preparing to say, well, sorry, Donald, we agree on all these other things. On this one, we don't.
Yeah.
And we're not going to be vectored into it. You know, it's going to cost us a bit. You know, there'll be things that, you know, you're going to have a go at us about. It'll cost you because we're not going to do some of the things you want to do. But maybe we can talk to the Russians or the Chinese or the Indians or BRICS or Iran, and we're going to do that. But I think that's what I call normal diplomacy, as opposed to what we've seen up to this point. And I think it's an opportunity for the Saudis to demonstrate their diplomatic competence, their ability to formulate statements, deliver them effectively, and withstand the kind of pressure they're going to be under once this happens. If the Saudi Arabians say no to Trump, even if it's a qualified no, I mean, all hell is going to be unleashed on them. You know, you know, everything will be unleashed, and it's going to be a really tough one. So it's going to be a massive test of Saudi Arabians' capability to operate at the highest levels of world diplomacy. I think they've got great background. I wish Turki Al-Faisal was still foreign minister, you know, but they've got lots of capability in their foreign ministry and a lot of experience and a lot of people who know how to take the flak. But I think it's going to be more than anything else a test of Saudi Arabian competence, operating at a high level diplomatic performer, rather than being, you know, someone who turns up at summits.
Yeah, actually, MBS made that point very clearly to Biden. I mean, he told President Biden he was not going to participate unless there is a path forward. That was even before the Gaza war. And so now, MBS, you are absolutely correct. He's in a very tough position. He is not going to move forward without a path forward for a Palestinian state. And that's his credibility within the Muslim world, his credibility in the Arab world, his credibility globally. And so that is an issue that Trump will have to deal with. And therefore, he needs to put more pressure on the Netanyahu government to allow such a phraseology to be put forth. And you're absolutely correct. MBS is not going to play without that phraseology. But as was, you know, as a point, the previous point was that he's not going to play unless that type of thing occurs.
So we pause on that issue, looking forward nervously to stage 2 or 3 in Gaza, and perhaps even more nervously to whether Saudi Arabia's insistence on a path to Palestinian statehood may or may not succeed. Let's turn our attention to Damascus. In Damascus, where Ahmad Al Shara'a has led Hayat Tahrir Sham and has formed an interim government. Now, Hayat Tahrir Sham, HTS, is a offshoot of some very radical groups. It's an amalgam of other groups. Yet it's come into power and has said all the right things to appeal to a broad social consensus. Eddie and I had a big discussion about this on our last show. I was more optimistic that it's going to work in some way. Eddie was deeply skeptical. Emile, can you just take us through perhaps the where you think Hayat Tahrir Sham and Ahmad Al Shara'a are now, and perhaps where they came from, how they move forward?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. You know, Hayat Tahrir Sham emerged, as you know, back in 2016 as an amalgam of those different groups. But what concerned me, what interested me at the time, and I wrote a piece about that back in 2016, that they had moved ideologically and practically from what I call global jihad to national jihad. And I think they realized that ISIS and Al-Qaeda, while they were such a global phenomena, they did not really change the realities of the Muslim world. And in a sense, I followed this trajectory from what I call the local to the global and back to the local. And when I was in government, my analysts and I studied at least 3-4 dozen local Islamic political parties across the Muslim world, from PAS in Malaysia, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Rifah in Turkey, Islamic Action Front in Jordan, Al-Nahda in Tunisia, and across the Muslim world. And in interviews with these parties, we concluded, as they told us, that if they want to bring about change in their respective countries, their agendas have to leave the global jihadist agenda and focus on their own regimes. You know, the far enemy, forget about the far enemy, and their immediate enemy is their own autocrats in their own countries. That has been the focus of these Islamic political parties. Most of them, the Sunni parties, most of them are grounded in Muslim Brotherhood ideology. So when HTS was formed, they adopted that position. And they adopted that position at that time before even they were in control of a part of Syria like Idlib, because they really believed that that was the path forward to liberate Syria from that regime.
But Emile, sorry to just jump in. The question is, they've clearly become Syrian, as you described. They've got Syrian people, they use Syrians. But the question is, can they become inclusive?
Well, that is the biggest challenge, one of the biggest challenges, as I mentioned in my article, that is facing them, right? And that is Syria, traditionally, in the last 50, 60 years, has primarily been a secular state. That was the Ba'ath Party, and since then has been, despite the autocratic nature of their regimes, it for the most part remained a secular state. And it is a secular state in a sense like Lebanon, primarily because of its diversity. I mean, Syria cannot possibly be or become an Islamic state. They have Muslims, Sunni Muslims, they have Shia Muslims, they have Alawites, they have Armenians, they have Kurds, they have all kinds of minorities. And if Ahmad Al Shara'a really wants to govern or rule Syria, he's got to accept this reality. His statements so far have been have moved in that direction, right? The government he's put is basically supposed to be a transitional government, which is the government that was in Idlib, the SSG, the Syria Salvation Government, what they call the SSG in Idlib. He moved that into Damascus. And he told the world that this is only a 3-month period. And so his biggest challenge, in addition to secularism versus sectarianism, I think his biggest challenge is to create a more inclusive government. And so the first marker I would look at is, once 3 months pass, what kind of government? Does it include minorities? Does it include women? Does it include Armenians, Kurds, and so on? And not just Sunni Muslim. I mean, he adheres to the Sunni branch of Islam, but the fact is that's only one segment of the population in Syria. What about the Druze? So you have Sunni Muslims, you have Shia Muslims, you have Alawites, you have Druze, all within Islam, right? And then you have the Christians, and then you have non-Arabs, Armenians, and Kurds. So
a useful marker would be in 3 months' time. So we need to have a point of reference. Eddie, would you like to come in?
Yeah, Nick, Emile, I defer to your expertise on this matter. Absolutely profound point that the ideology of political Islam, whatever the right word for it is, is evolving constantly, and we saw the failed, well, it wasn't a failed, the Muslim Brotherhood were politically very successful in Egypt. The reason they're not there, they were deposed by a military coup with a certain amount of popular support. And you can see the evolution, and certainly you can see that Hamas will evolve. All these, they are in touch with reality. And I can see all that happening. So that was really a very profound point, that the political Islam is now recognizes the idea of a sort of the equivalent to, Communist International of the Soviet Union is now giving way to, socialism or Islam in one country type of thinking. The issues that you've raised also, which is about the diversity of Syria. And of course, the parallel here, which France and I will remember well, and you as well, Emile, is what happened in Iraq after 2003, where we had regime change. The big difference is that regime change was achieved by foreign intervention, whilst the foreign intervention in Syria, which is there, and it can't be disputed that Turkey's the only reason that Ahmad Al Shara'a is where he is because he's had the support of Turkey. So that means that isn't happening, and that certainly was contentious. But what do you think the chances that even if HDS or Ahmad Al Shara'a does all the right things, do you think that Syria's got a better prospect of avoiding vociferous violence and internecine struggle than Iraq had in 2003? Do you think, what are the reasons that you could suggest to me why, given the circumstances somewhat similar, the violent deposition of an existing regime that had been there for decades, a country that was economically wrecked, as Iraq was and Syria is, armed groups, huge amounts of weapons, foreign powers involved, and a multitude of communities, and often not seeing particularly eye to eye about very basic things like, what you should wear, you go shopping. So can you give me the reason why the optimists like Francis might believe that Syria is not going to go down the terrible route that Iraq took, at least for the first 5 or 8 years, and that it'll be able to avoid all those things? Are there any individual things? Is it a question of leadership, policy, ideology, foreign support? What do you think?
Well, I don't think really, I see your analogy. I don't think the analogy truly applies to the Iraqi analogy applies to Syria. But that is also a major challenge. That is the presence and influence of foreign troops and foreign players in Syria. So we have Turkey in the north and pro-Turkey groups in the northeast, and we have Israel in the Golan Heights and so-called the neutral zone. And that is a reality. So what Al Shara'a, I believe, has already said, and I think he believes that he really has no conflict with foreign powers. That, for example, I know this is Pollyannish, but Israel now wants, now that Hezbollah, has left Syria, once Iran is no longer using Syria as a bridge to Hezbollah, then he can reach an agreement about the border with Israel on the Golan Heights.
That's very optimistic.
That is optimistic, I admit. But the reality is that if there are, and the role of foreign powers here is important. If the United States and the EU and the United Kingdom and other countries are already interested in seeing Ahmad Al Shara'a succeed in Syria, they can easily show Israel and convince Israel, if those weapon depots are gone, if Iran no longer provides weapons through Syria to Hezbollah, if Hezbollah's position in Syria has been reduced dramatically, then there is really no reason for Israel to continue to bomb Syria. Then if that is the case, then they could arrive at some sort of an agreement about the Golan. And I think Ahmad Shara'a would even tolerate for the first year more Israeli encroachment on territories in the Golan. I mean, his goal is to settle Syria itself and the areas, the Kurds, with Turkey. So the foreign involvement is another major challenge. Now, Turkey supports him. Turkey supports him ideologically also, because Turkey is supposed to be AKP, and base is an outgrowth of Refah Party, which is basically a nationalist Islamic party, regardless of what Erdogan has done recently. But so he can come to an agreement with Turkey over that sliver of territory in the north that Turkey controls almost, directly or indirectly. The question is, what arrangement will Turkey have with the Kurds? And therefore, how will that impact the Al Shara'a government in Damascus? So these are serious challenges. I do not mean to minimize them at all. But what my optimism is, the other players all are interested in seeing this government or this form of government under Ahmad Al Shara'a succeed in Syria.
Because
yes, Emile, I'm fascinated by your observation, which seems to be, obviously he's got domestic challenges, and the immediate one is the economy and humanitarian relief and getting aid in, and that's number one issue. But the priority would be in reaching an accommodation with neighbours, to get the neighbours on side. So it has Turkey getting Israel on side makes sense from that context. So you stop people interfering, and then in some way or other, I mean, the Iranians, I mean, he has said as much, is that he's trying to be friend with neighbours. I mean, he's de-escalated the rhetoric about Iran and Iranian imperialism. That's gone down. So that would be the first thing. So that's our set of challenges. And you are, I mean, I agree with you totally. If you have, I mean, you're going to have international consensus on this, aren't you? So it's not going to be just America and the EU. Yeah. Russia is going to have a say on this, is it not? Yeah. And so that you need a sort of an overarching international consensus. But then you get into the really difficult thing, which is where, you know, my heart sinks when I look to the future, because he's talking about, I mean, I think quite wisely, and again, which is different from what happened in Iraq, although, is that the Iraq moved very quickly to set up a new constitution, and they were dying to have elections for obvious reasons, because they wanted to convince the America and Britain, who had brought about the change, that Iraq was fundamentally transformed and there would be a democratic Iraq. And of course, what happened, as soon as you have elections in a deeply divided society, and let's not pretend that Syria is anything other but a divided society, politicians will always play on those divisions, always do it. That's how you get votes. So, you know, it's like, you know, in Northern Ireland, you know, if you want to get votes, you know that you've got to play one card or the other. It's very difficult to be the sensible person in the middle. You're going to lose votes. And the constituencies in Syria, I mean, it's, you know, the capacity for populist type politicians ramping up feelings within the country. And then secondly, you know, being able to deliver a stable government, which I assume would be some form of coalition. I mean, some form of coalition. I mean, you have to give me an example in the Middle East and the Arab world where a coalition government with real power has succeeded, because look at Lebanon. So, I mean, I can see the first stage in my mind with Trump in power. I mean, it's a strange one to say, that Trump using his influence and being a deal doer. I can see something like that being done, and quite quickly. But the next stage of actually constructing a domestic consensus behind a government which is representative and is prepared and can satisfy, on the one hand, the political aspirations of political Islamists who have died for their campaign, and the Alawite community who was still longing after a previous regime, and then the other ethnic groups, the Druzes and others. So forgive me for being negative. Maybe you can say something about that prospect, Emile. That's going to cheer me up.
Well, all right. Unfortunately, there's not much cheering up till this point, right? The cheering is, first, all of those minorities in Syria have suffered. So the the destruction that Assad brought on that country was not limited to Sunni Muslims. The Druze suffered, Armenians suffered, the Kurds suffered, Christians suffered. So the suffering has been universal across the country. But the point I want to make is that the region has come out in support of this new regime in Syria. The Arab region, plus Iran indirectly, Turkey definitely. Then the outside region, many other Muslim countries supported that. But key players, European, American, and others, have also reached out to the regime and sent high-level emissaries to talk to the new regime. So already this regime has gotten the support of the region and beyond the region. Now, in fact, that's why I said the marker is 3 months from now. If he is going to succeed, he's got to have an inclusive council or group or whatever to write a new constitution, if they want to write a new constitution, or to select government. The ministers have got to reflect the diversity of the country. He does not have to go as far as the confessional sectarian system that happens in, or that is present in Lebanon, but he does not have to assign seats according to sectarian affiliations. But Syria, he can do that in Syria, because if he is going to focus on the Syrian society, and he does because he knows Syria, then he should realize, and I think he will realize if he wants to succeed, that he's got to have that diversity represented in his new governmental system. And I think that is the issue with, and when we studied other Islamic parties throughout the Muslim world, I mean, I visited every Muslim majority country in the world, and other than Iran, of course, I couldn't go to Iran, and every Muslim minority country in the world. And I talked to many of these Islamic parties. And in some, like in Indonesia, they realize that Indonesia, even though it's a majority Muslim country, but there are other minorities that have to be included in the government to succeed. And that's what the Islamic Party has done. And that's what the Islamic Party, even in Jordan and Tunisia, did. So I think Ahmad Al Shara'a, so far, his statements reflect that inclusive view. And as I said, we have to wait to see if that transitional government stops at 3 months and not continue. Well, we need another year, or then that. If that happens, then really all bets are off. But
he gave himself 3 years to create a constitution and 4 years to an election. So there's quite a long time. Yes. I'm glad to have your immediate markers there. Emile, as we come to our final topic, I'd like to. We've got an image there of a Syria where there's a region and an international community beaming goodwill, and the Syrians it's up to them to kind of make a fist of it. One of the major losers in this, which Eddie mentioned just now, is Iran and its ally in Hezbollah. So perhaps as a final thought, where do you see this changing Iran? I ask with particular reference to the new government there and Zarif, who's the vice president for foreign affairs, making a call to the region, talking of the West Asian Muslim Dialogue Association. Is that significant? It may not be, but it indicates Iran is now finding a new way of reaching out, having previously tried to work to achieve a local regional significance through the Shiite minorities. It seems to be looking for a different direction. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm right.
No, I think you are right. I think Iran has realized that its so-called strategic doctrine that is based on proxies, that the proxies have been part of its strategic doctrine. And the proxies include, as you know, Hezbollah and sometimes Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen, and the militias in Iraq, and some militias in Syria. But Iran has realized now that has been a failure. Hezbollah has become is forced to become a national party rather than part of the Communist International, you see, or part of this international global jihad. The reality is that what happened in the Lebanese parliament, I just finished an article and is being considered for publication about that. The election of the president and the election of the prime minister has never happened in years in Lebanon.
After many, many years.
After many years. And it happened because Hezbollah could not derail the process. As you well know, in the last 20 years, no president or no prime minister occurred or was elected in Lebanon without Hezbollah's approval. Hezbollah could not derail that. I mean, General Aoun lost the first ballot, but he won the second ballot with a huge majority out of the 128 members of that parliament. And then the prime minister, Salam, who is, of course, a renowned international jurist and so on, won immediately the first ballot with a huge majority. And Hezbollah could not derail that. And another coalition, and Hezbollah could not even form a coalition with some of the other Christian and Shia parties to thwart that election. So Hezbollah realized that it is no longer viewed as the so-called guardian of South Lebanon or guardian of Lebanon. And I would not be surprised if in the next year or two that resolution 1701 is implemented in Lebanon, whereby the Lebanese army will be in charge of the south, if you will, like any border, like Jordan or Egypt or with Israel, and that border will become just a Lebanese-Israeli border that will be calm. And so I think Hezbollah and Iran are now past the point of pretending that they are the guardians of Islam and Islamic jihad worldwide. Some of them still use that rhetoric, but Iran is wise enough to reach to pursue other venues. So you were absolutely correct in your statement about Iran. So I really see Lebanon. I'm equally optimistic about Lebanon because of what has happened, despite all the challenges that country faces. Corruption is one major challenge. This sectarian structure is one major challenge.
Yes.
To your point earlier, Francis, that I established a 3-month marker, even though he said it will take years for the constitution. But the marker is important because he will have to establish a group to begin to review a new constitution. And that group is very critical to be inclusive. And that is why the 3-month marker to me is very important. I mean, I studied the promulgation of the Bahraini constitution years back in 1972, and I attended every session of the Majlis at the time as a senior Fulbright scholar in Bahrain. And the formulation of that constitution included the Shia and so on, even though under the umbrella of the Sunni al-Khalifa. And that's why the Iraqi analogy, in a sense, does not necessarily apply to Syria because of the structure of that society. And Lebanon is the same. So I think Hezbollah and Iran now are pulling back because they realize they have been weakened and pummeled severely by Israel. And I don't think they are going to try to influence events in Syria and as well as in Lebanon later on.
Emile, thank you. This has been an absolute wonderful tour d'horizon, a tour de force from yourself, all the details there. We've come to the end of our time. I'd like to thank you very much. And I'd also like to thank you for having started on some of the more gloomy outlooks. To end with an optimistic outlook is very exciting.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Right.
Thank you, Emile. It's a joy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So you've heard a lot there. You've heard a lot from an expert on his topic. You may disagree. On Syria, most people will have their own views, and we would like to hear from you. Do you think that the Saudis will or will not make a deal with Israel? Do you think that the Syrian new interim government will go through? We'd like to hear from you. So please get in touch. Please tell us what you think, and we can shape ourselves and plan the next few episodes. So for now, thank you. I wish you well. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.